Savannah, Georgia, March 1846. The Devereaux townhouse stands on a clean street and pretends it is clean inside. Brick facade, shuttered windows, polished brass, an address designed to reassure the public that order lives here. That is the first lie. Order does not live here. Control lives here, and control always leaves marks, even when it tries to hide them behind lace curtains and Sunday manners. The woman at the center of this house is Nell Harrow Devereaux, age 34, a mistress by title and by appetite. She does not need to raise her voice often. She uses the architecture. She uses the law. She uses the terror of what happens after the doors close. And she uses the simplest weapon of all, the certainty that no one important will question her version of reality. You need to understand what 1846 looks like on paper. In Savannah, property is a language people speak fluently. They write it, register it, insure it, borrow against it. They measure human beings in the same ink. When Nell Harrow says mine, she means bodies, time, breath, and future. She means the right to sell your child. She means the right to break your ribs and call it discipline. She means the right to turn a living person into a receipt. And society, polite society, applauds this arrangement because it keeps the economy humming and the pews filled. That is not history as a distant horror. That is policy, practiced daily, with clean hands. Inside that house is a young black woman named Ama Mara Kofi, 21 years old in 1846. The records, when they exist, do not call her Ama. They call her Mary or Mara, as if renaming is ownership's first ceremony. She is listed as house servant, which is a soft phrase used to conceal hard work and harder violations. In Nell's world, Mara is supposed to be invisible, present only as utility, an object that moves when commanded and disappears when not needed. But invisibility cuts both ways. When people assume you are incapable of agency, they stop guarding against it. They talk around you. They confess in front of you. They grow careless. And Mara, forced into silence, learns to listen with precision. This house runs on routines. Breakfast trays, linen inventories, silver counted twice, laundry boiled until hands crack. And beneath those routines is a second system, unwritten, but consistent. Who gets sent to the cellar after an argument? Who comes back limping? Who does not come back at all? In March 1846, there is a name whispered among the servants and then crushed back down into quiet. Dorothea Wynne, 16 years old, enslaved, assigned to upstairs work. Dorothea is not lost. She is not misplaced. She does not simply run away, as Nell will later insist with a practiced sigh. Dorothea disappears the way evidence disappears, because someone with power removes it, and everyone with fear learns to cooperate. The official story is assembled quickly. Nell tells neighbors Dorothea was ungrateful, unstable, tempted by bad influences. She tells the church Dorothea was led astray. She tells the city watch Dorothea fled. Notice the pattern. The missing girl becomes the criminal in every version. That is not an accident. It is a technique. If Dorothea is framed as immoral, then what happens to her becomes deserved. The public gets to feel righteous instead of responsible. And the house gets to continue without disruption. But the people inside the house know something else. They know about the back stairwell that leads to locked storage. They know about the late-night carriage that comes without lamps. They know about Elias Rooker, the attorney in his 40s who visits too often for simple paperwork. who drinks Nell's brandy like he owns the glass, who calls violence household management. Rooker is not a footnote. He is a mechanism. He drafts documents that sanitize brutality. He speaks the language of courts, and that language, in 1846 Georgia, is a shield. When violence is translated into legal phrasing, it becomes respectable. When a crime is called a correction, it becomes invisible. Mara watches the pattern of the visits. Rooker appears after incidents, not before them. He comes when something needs to be reclassified, retitled, explained away. A bruise becomes clumsiness. A scream becomes hysteria. A missing child becomes absconded. And then there is the ledger, Nell's ledger. It is not just household expenses. It is discipline monetized. Payments to the watch, fees for advertisements about runaways, the cost of shackles, the doctor's bills for bodies that must be kept alive enough to work. The ledger is a confession written in numbers. This is the part the polite tellers leave out. Slavery was not only a moral atrocity, it was an administrative system. It had forms, procedures, receipts, contracts, and enforcement. It did not survive because people were ignorant. It survived because people were organized. It survived because respectable citizens chose paperwork over conscience. That is why the Devereaux house is not one bad mistress. It is an example of how the whole machine functions when no one stops it. Mara's position gives her access, but access alone is not power. In March 1846, she is still owned, still trapped under legal definitions that describe her as property. Her body belongs to Nell on paper. Her testimony, if she gave it, would be discounted. Her grief would be inconvenient. That is the cage. But Mara is not building an emotional case. She is building a factual one. She learns who receives money from Nell. She learns which merchants extend credit. She learns which neighbors accept gifts to look away. She learns which servants were forced to sign marks on documents they could not read. Every time the house consumes someone, it leaves a trail, if you know where to look. And Mara looks. She watches the kitchen deliveries and notes how often certain items arrive after punishments. Laudanum, bandages, extra lye. She watches the tailor's bills and sees clothing purchased for someone who never appears in public. She watches Nell's social calendar and understands the rhythms of distraction. Tea parties after nights of screaming, church attendance after violence, charity committees as an alibi factory. Nell does not merely harm people. She stages innocence. That is the kind of predator society rewards, because staged innocence is easier to accept than the truth. Dorothea's disappearance becomes the fracture line. It is the moment Mara stops waiting for a miracle and starts counting. Counting is how you survive when you cannot fight directly. Counting tells you what is real. Counting tells you what repeats. Counting tells you where the system has a seam. In 1846, in a state designed to deny her personhood, Mara begins the work that will later be called impossible. Not heroic. Not romantic. Methodical. Quiet. Surgical. Because here is the accusation that hangs over this house like smoke. Dorothea did not vanish into thin air. She was removed. By violence. By sale. By disposal. By whatever method keeps Nell's reputation intact. And everyone who accepted Nell's story helped bury Dorothea a second time. The public loves to ask, centuries later, why the enslaved did not just speak up. This is why. In 1846, speaking up is a luxury reserved for those society already recognizes as human. For Mara, Speaking up without leverage is not bravery. It is a death sentence. So she chooses leverage. And she begins at the only place the system cannot ignore: money and law. Not because the law is moral, but because the law is a machine, cold, predictable, hungry for paperwork. If you can feed it the right documents, it will move, even against the people it was built to protect. That is the dark irony Mara will exploit. And the house, drunk on its own certainty, will not see her coming. If you're listening from somewhere, anywhere, comment where you're from. And subscribe, because the next step is not revenge yet. It's the accumulation. The slow, deliberate gathering of proof and payment in a world that insists a black woman cannot own anything, not even her own future. April 1847. Savannah does what it always does. It smiles in daylight and bargains in shadow. The Devereaux townhouse keeps breathing, keeps hosting, keeps pretending Dorothea Wynne never existed. This is how the system stays intact, by training everyone to forget on schedule. Nell Harrow Devereaux understands that forgetting is not passive. It is engineered. She distributes small kindnesses like bribes. A basket to a neighbor, a donation to the church, a polite visit to the magistrate's wife. Then, when the subject of Dorothea surfaces, she produces the same line each time: "The girl ran," and the room obliges her. People don't believe Nell because she is convincing. They believe her because it is cheaper than the truth. Inside the house, Mara learns the second language of slavery: numbers. Not the comforting fiction that slavery was only whips and chains. The deeper reality is ledgers, receipts, and controlled movement. In April 1847, Mara is 22. She is still classified as property. Yet Nell has begun using her as a tool for outside errands, market runs, deliveries, messages, because house staff must make the house function. That is the contradiction. To extract maximum labor, the owner must sometimes grant minimum mobility. And every inch of mobility is a crack. Mara's first money does not arrive like a miracle. It arrives like residue. Coins that should have been discarded. Change she is told she can keep, then later demanded back. Tips from merchants who feel a brief shame and pay to silence it. A sliver from every task that Nell treats as meaningless. Mara does not celebrate these coins. She counts them the way a prisoner counts days. Not with hope, but with discipline. Because in 1847, for an enslaved woman, money is not freedom. Money is a dangerous illusion unless it becomes a documented fact. There is a practice in Savannah that polite society pretends is benign. Hiring out. Slaveholders rent enslaved labor to others for a fee. It is a market in human time. In June 1847, Nell begins allowing Mara to do small sewing and laundering for outside households. Not as an act of generosity, as a profit stream. Nell sets the terms. How many hours? Which clients? What portion of payment comes back to the Devereaux kitchen? She frames it as a privilege. It is not. It is a calculation. But calculations can be reversed if the math is tracked. Mara does not hide money in a jar and pray. She constructs two ledgers, one to satisfy Nell, one to survive Nell. The visible ledger is simple. Dates, jobs, amounts owed to the household. It reassures the mistress that everything remains under control. The hidden ledger is more precise. Names of clients, payments, witnesses, and what was exchanged in addition to coin, fabric remnants, soap, thread, sometimes information. Because Mara is buying more than freedom. She is buying a map of the people who will later be forced to admit what they saw. By September 1847, Mara understands a brutal fact. Cash is fragile. It can be stolen. It can be seized. It can be reclassified as the master's property the moment it becomes visible. So she converts cash into assets that are less obvious. A bolt of cloth can be traded. A tool can be pawned. A favor can be collected later. She uses the network that slavery unintentionally creates. Enslaved people moving between houses, kitchens, docks, stables, carrying gossip, warnings, and sometimes small packages that look like nothing. The system thinks these people are interchangeable. That is why it underestimates the intelligence of their coordination. This is where the story stops being comfortable. Because the money Mara gathers is not extra income. It is extracted from the same violence that starves her. Every coin is paid for by sleep denied, by wounds ignored, by the constant threat of being sold south. When modern audiences romanticize buying freedom, they sanitize what it meant. Bargaining for your own body with the very labor stolen from that body. That is not an inspiring anecdote. It is an indictment. October 1847. Nell begins tightening control again. Not because she senses Mara's plan. Nell doesn't think Mara is capable of planning. Nell tightens control because rumors persist. Dorothea's name still circulates in small, stubborn ways. A dock worker says he saw a girl matching her description moved at night. A washerwoman claims she heard screams the week Dorothea vanished. None of it becomes formal complaint, because formal complaint is dangerous. But it irritates Nell. And when a slaveholder is irritated, someone inside the house pays. Mara watches punishment the way an investigator watches a suspect. Not for drama, but for method. Who orders it? Who executes it? Who cleans it? Who records it? In November 1847, she sees the same sequence repeat after a kitchen girl drops a plate. Nell's eyes go flat. An overseer is called. The cellar door opens, and afterward there is a doctor's visit billed discreetly. The ledger entries match the bruises. The household's cruelty is not chaotic. It is scheduled. And Elias Rooker stays close. In December 1847, he arrives with paperwork under his arm and calm in his voice. He is the kind of man who believes ink absolves him. He tells Nell about debt, about a creditor pressing, about how arrangements can be made. He speaks as if the law is a private tool for the affluent. Because in 1847 Georgia, it often is. Mara stands nearby pouring brandy. They do not lower their voices enough. They do not imagine she understands. They call her girl and continue talking about the sale of assets as if they are discussing furniture. But Mara hears a key phrase that night, one that becomes a hinge in her mind. Court sale. Rooker uses it casually, almost fondly. A court sale is where debts and disputes are resolved by selling property under legal authority. It sounds clean. It is not. It is the law laundering desperation into legitimacy. And in a slave society, property includes people. January 1848. Mara's hidden ledger changes. She begins recording legal vocabulary, not just payments. She repeats terms until they become tools. Probate, guardianship, lien, transfer, title. She learns that white men do not fear morality. They fear defects in paperwork. She learns that a single misfiled document can topple a claim. She learns that the system's confidence is built on routine, on the assumption that the buyer is always a white man, that the signer always understands, that the court always sees what it expects to see. Mara also learns how quickly the system punishes those who are too visible. A free black man in Savannah can be seized on a pretext. A literate black person is treated as a threat, so she does not put her own name anywhere. She builds through intermediaries. She speaks in fragments. She lets other people underestimate her. That underestimation is not just insult, it is camouflage. By March 1848, the money has become a quiet weight. Not enough to purchase legal freedom outright, because those prices are set to be just out of reach, but enough to matter if the right moment arrives. And Mara is no longer waiting passively for that moment. She is preparing to manufacture it. That is the distinction between survival and strategy. Survival endures. Strategy aims. Now listen carefully. The common story would tell you this is where hope enters. It doesn't. What enters is resolve sharpened into something colder. Mara's goal is not merely to walk away from the Devereaux house. Walking away would leave the house intact. It would leave Nell untouched. It would leave Dorothea buried in silence. Mara is building leverage because she understands a moral truth the powerful never want spoken aloud. If you escape alone, the machine keeps operating. If you expose the machine, it slows, maybe only for a moment, maybe only in one district, but it loses the luxury of innocence. In the spring of 1848, Mara makes her first deliberate investment in testimony. She gives a coin to a stable boy who witnessed the late-night carriage. She trades cloth to a neighbor's cook who heard Nell and Rooker arguing about moving the girl. She does not ask for dramatic confessions. She asks for dates. Times. Names. She is building a timeline because timelines are harder to dismiss than tears. This is how an enslaved woman begins to weaponize truth in a world designed to deny her credibility. And here is the sermon the era deserves. Forgetting is complicity. Not only for Nell, but for every person who enjoyed the comfort provided by that house and chose not to ask what it cost. In 1847 and 1848, Savannah is full of people who could have demanded answers about Dorothea Wynne. They did not. They accepted the convenience story because convenience is the ally of evil. Mara does not have the luxury of convenience. She has paper, patience, and an enemy that believes she is incapable of both. The next phase is not about courage. It is about exploiting the law's blind spot, the place where arrogance meets procedure, and procedure can be forced to turn on its master. Charleston, South Carolina, August 1848. Savannah taught Mara how to count. Charleston teaches her what those numbers can become when they touch a courthouse. The Devereaux townhouse still stands, still performs respectability, but the foundation has shifted. Not because Nell Harrow Devereaux has gained a conscience. She hasn't. The shift comes from something far more reliable than morality. Debt. In 1848, debt is the one chain even the powerful pretend to fear. It's also the one chain they expect to slip off with the right lawyer, the right judge, the right paperwork. And that expectation, arrogant, routine, almost automatic, is exactly where the seam opens. Elias Rooker brings the seam with him. He travels between Savannah and Charleston as if the coast itself belongs to his profession. He is 46 now, thinning at the crown, careful with his hands, careless with human lives. He talks about arrangements and liens and security the way a butcher talks about cuts of meat. In August 1848, the Devereaux household's creditors are no longer quiet. A merchant house wants payment. A lender wants collateral formalized. A family dispute threatens to drag Nell's private accounting into daylight. And when a slaveholder's private accounting risks becoming public, the first response is not repentance. It is legal manipulation. Mara follows the movement. She is not allowed to accompany Nell as an equal, but she is allowed to carry bags, to wait in corridors, to stand near doors. Slavery grants access under the disguise of servitude. In Charleston, she learns the geography of power. Clerks' offices, notary desks, stairwells that smell like ink and sweat, rooms where men decide human fates without ever looking at human faces. The courthouse is not dramatic. That is its horror. It is ordinary. It is bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is where violence becomes permanent. There is a moment in late August, small, almost forgettable, when Mara realizes what kind of war she is in. She sees a document on Rooker's desk. A petition tied to a guardianship dispute involving Nell's husband's estate, Hugh Devereaux, deceased since February 1846. The death is the quiet engine behind the current crisis. Hugh's passing left obligations, claims, and a contested set of assets. Nell has been living as if the household is entirely hers, as if grief gave her ownership. But law is not grief. Law is paperwork. And paperwork wants signatures. In Charleston, Mara hears a phrase she does not ignore. Court-authorized sale. It sounds sterile. It is not. It means a judge can order property sold to satisfy debt or settle estate matters. And in this era, a human being can be that property, parceled with furniture and land as if breath is an accessory. The sale is framed as neutral, but neutrality is a costume the law wears while it commits atrocities with clean hands. Here is what matters. Court sales do not care about dignity. They care about compliance. Notices posted. Petitions filed. Bonds posted. Titles transferred. Clerks stamping documents they barely read because the system runs on speed and habit. In 1848, habit is a vulnerability. The court expects certain kinds of buyers, certain kinds of signatures, certain kinds of order. It does not expect a black woman to understand procedure or to exploit it. That expectation is not just racist. It is operationally stupid. And Mara is watching, learning how stupidity becomes an opening. She also learns what the law calls a legal person. It is a word that sounds philosophical until you see what it does. In Charleston, free black people exist, but under restrictions designed to remind them they are tolerated, not protected. Enslaved black people, like Mara, are explicitly denied standing. The system doesn't merely oppress, it defines. It defines who counts. And then it pretends the definition is reality. The lesson is clear. Mara cannot fight as herself, not directly. If she steps forward as Ama Kofi, the machine will reject her like a forged coin. So she begins to think like the machine. If she cannot enter through the front door, she will enter through an accepted proxy, someone the system recognizes enough to process. In September 1848, she meets the person who will later become that proxy. Joseph P. Clay, a free black carpenter, 32, living in Charleston's precarious margin of legality. Clay is not a savior. He is a man surviving inside a tightening cage. That makes him cautious, not heroic. Mara approaches him the only way a threatened person can, indirectly, through a shared contact, with a request that sounds like work, not conspiracy. She offers payment for carpentry on a church bench. Then she tests him with a second job, then a third. Trust is built in installments because betrayal is too common to risk otherwise. Clay can read. That matters. Literacy in this world is not just skill, it is contraband. With Clay's help, Mara begins collecting copies, partial, imperfect, but real, of notices posted for sales, petitions filed for debts, and bond requirements in guardianship cases. She learns that a sale can be valid even if the buyer never appears in person, as long as the buyer's identity is acceptable on paper. She learns that intermediaries are common. The law already expects middlemen. It just expects them to be white. And this is where the seam becomes visible. The system's racism creates blind spots. Courts assume black people are objects, not actors. So they build processes that fail to check for black agency. They verify what they already believe. They overlook what contradicts it. This isn't a moral argument. It's a mechanical one. When a machine is designed with a false premise, it breaks in predictable places. Mara is mapping those places. By October 1848, the Devereaux situation worsens. Nell's creditors want reassurance. Rooker proposes a solution. Consolidate assets, transfer certain properties into protective structures, and, if necessary, liquidate. Liquidate is the word the powerful use when they mean sell people. Mara listens as if she is invisible. She records dates in her head. She notes which items are named as collateral. She hears a list that includes enslaved persons with valuations attached. The list is cold. The list is proof that the household's violence is not accidental. It is accounted for. There is another ingredient to the crack. Reputation. Nell is not merely in debt. She is in danger of scandal. Dorothea's disappearance has not died. It has only been suffocated. Rumors persist, enough to threaten the social shield that keeps Nell safe. Rooker understands this. In November 1848, he advises Nell to be careful with transfers. Careful means move assets in ways that appear lawful, so no one can accuse her of desperation. Because desperation makes people look closer. And being looked at is the one thing Nell cannot survive. Mara understands something Nell does not. The law is not loyal. It is not moral, and it is not protective. It is procedural. If you feed it the right forms, it will validate atrocity. But if you feed it the right forms with the right timing, it will also validate reversal. That is the nightmare hidden inside legal systems built on dehumanization. Once you allow people to be property, you create a marketplace where ownership can change hands. And when ownership changes hands, power can flip, not by justice, but by the same indifferent machinery that once enforced the vulm. December 1848. Mara makes a disciplined choice. She stops focusing on buying freedom in the naive sense. She pivots toward buying leverage. She keeps earning, keeps converting cash into tradable assets, but now she also invests in legal readiness. Notary fees paid quietly through Clay, copies of notices purchased, the names of clerks who accept small tips to find a file faster. Every step is risky. Every step could be discovered and punished. But Mara is not gambling. She is calculating. And let's name the moral disgrace plainly. The system that refuses Mara personhood is the same system that will later process a transaction engineered by her. That is the hypocrisy at the center of this story. Courts will not recognize her humanity, but they will recognize her money if it arrives wearing an acceptable signature. They will not hear her testimony, but they will stamp her contract, if it is formatted correctly. This is not a flattering portrait of law. It is an exposure. By January 1849, the crack is no longer theoretical. It is imminent. Nell's financial pressure, Rooker's legal maneuvering, and the estate's unresolved obligations are converging toward a court-supervised action, some formal sale, some transfer, some public record event where control can shift. Mara does not need the court to love her. She needs the court to process. That is the difference between begging for mercy and forcing procedure. Remember this, because history tries to make stories like this sentimental. It is not sentimental. A young black woman, denied every protection, is learning to weaponize a system designed to erase her. She is not doing it for applause. She is doing it because Dorothea Wynn's disappearance is still sitting in the walls like a body no one wants to find. And if the law will not admit the crime, then Mara will bring the law something it cannot ignore. A transfer of power written in the language the powerful worship, paper, seal, and signature. May 1850. Savannah again. Same humid air, same polished door knockers, same public manners that conceal private violence. But the Devereux townhouse is no longer a stable kingdom. It is a stressed machine. You can hear it in the way Nell Harrow Devereux speaks, too quickly, too sharply, with that brittle urgency of someone who believes control is a right, not a privilege. The creditors have names now, and they are not shy. The estate of Hugh Devereux, dead since February 1846, still bleeds obligations. Elias Rooker has been promising solutions for 2 years, and in 1850, the clock is finally loud enough to panic even the people who think panic is for the poor. This is the chapter people don't want to imagine, because it makes the system look stupid. Not evil, stupid. It shows how arrogance creates openings. The court doesn't wake up one morning and decide to punish Nell. It simply does what it does when money is owed and paperwork is overdue. It demands formal action. A petition is filed. A bond is questioned. A notice is posted. And then, the thing that slavery always feared, documentation, moves forward. On May 17th, Tuxtantis Ashtuoni Shimtai Penkias de Shemt, a notice is circulated that certain assets tied to the Devereux estate will be subject to sale to satisfy claims and settle disputes. Assets. That word is the disinfectant. It scrubs the smell of human suffering off the page. The notice lists household property and, quietly, as if it is ordinary, names of enslaved persons with valuations. Among them is Amma Mara Kofi. She reads her own name the way you read a threat, because that is what it is. She can be sold at any moment to plug Nell's financial holes. And this is where the plan stops being a theory and becomes a knife. Mara has spent years collecting coins, converting them into trade, hiding value in plain objects, and routing payments through a free man the court recognizes. Joseph P. Clay. Clay is not in Savannah by accident. He arrives in early May 1850 with a carpenter's excuse and a document pouch under his shirt. Everything about the arrangement is built to survive inspection. If anyone asks, he's there for work. If anyone pries, he has receipts that look ordinary. The brilliance of the plan is not in theatrics. It is in how boring it appears. Elias Rooker believes he controls this process. He believes a sale is a controlled burn. You sacrifice a few pieces to protect the rest. He expects to direct bidders, steer outcomes, and keep the Devereux name intact. He expects the buyer to be someone from his world. Because in this world, buyers are always men with property, men with standing, men with whiteness. That expectation is his blindfold. The purchase is executed through a structure the law already accepts. An intermediary bidder. On May 24th, Tukstantis ashtuoni shimtai penkias de shimt. In a courthouse room that smells like ink and sweat, Clay registers as a buyer for specific items tied to the estate. He is not buying land. He is not buying a carriage. He is buying a legal instrument. The target is not ownership in the childish sense. The target is control over Nell's immediate leverage, her labor force, and her household structure at the precise moment her position is weakest. Clay submits funds that do not look miraculous because they are not. They are assembled. They are layered. They are documented enough to pass but opaque enough to protect Mara. And then comes the legal crack Mara has been waiting for. A defect in Nell's shield. Hugh Devereaux's estate is tangled with guardianship claims involving a younger relative, and certain assets are technically held under court supervision pending resolution. Rooker tries to maneuver around it, but procedure is procedure. When the court orders sale under specific conditions, it doesn't care about Nell's pride. It cares that the sale is executed as noticed. It cares that bids are accepted. It cares that money changes hands. What happens next is the kind of reversal that only feels impossible because the public has been trained to underestimate enslaved people's intelligence. Clay's bid is accepted. The clerk stamps the transfer. The transaction becomes real in the only way the system acknowledges reality. In the record. And inside that record, the Devereaux universe shifts. Now, here is the line that makes people uncomfortable. Mara does not step into the courthouse as herself. She cannot. The system forbids it. She steps into the courthouse through a proxy the system recognizes, Clay, and through a contract that defines her role indirectly. That is not deception. It is adaptation. When law is built to exclude you, you either accept death quietly or you learn to speak through its loopholes. Mara speaks. By June 1850, the consequences begin to ripple. Clay holds legal title to specific property acquired in the sale, property that includes labor assignments and, crucially, the right to determine where certain individuals reside and work. In a slave system, control is everything. Nell understands this instantly and reacts like a cornered animal. She calls it fraud. She calls it theft. She calls it impossible. Notice she does not call it illegal at first, because she knows it passed through legal channels. She calls it impossible because she believes the world is obligated to behave according to her expectations. Nell demands Rooker fix it. Rooker, for the first time, is careful with his voice. He knows something Nell doesn't want to admit. Courts don't reverse sales easily, not when creditors are watching, not when procedure was followed, not when the buyer's money is real. To reverse it, Nell would have to claim her own process was defective, meaning she would have to expose the sloppiness, desperation, or misrepresentation she used to get here. In other words, to undo the purchase, she must open the door to scrutiny. And scrutiny is what she has spent 4 years avoiding since Dorothea vanished. This is where Mara finally appears, not in public, not in a speech, but in action. She forces Nell to feel what the enslaved feel every day. Uncertainty, lack of control, the terror of someone else making decisions about your body and your life. Mara does not strike Nell. Mara does something worse in a slave society. She applies the law to Nell. She reduces Nell's authority to something conditional and reviewable. She turns Nell from sovereign into subject. In July 1850, a private meeting occurs in the townhouse where Nell attempts negotiation. This is not mercy. It's self-preservation. Nell offers favors, money, promises of better treatment. She talks as if cruelty was a misunderstanding. Mara listens without emotion because she understands the core truth. Nell is not sorry. Nell is threatened. And threatened people confess things they would never confess to a court. Mara's leverage is not merely the sale. It is what she has been building since 1847. Names, dates, payments, patterns, witnesses. She knows about the late-night carriage. She knows about the doctor's visits after punishments. She knows about hush money routed through Rooker. She knows where the ledger is kept and which pages are written in a different hand. She knows which rooms are locked and why. The purchase is not the end. It is the key that opens the house for inspection. By August 1850, Nell is trapped between two dangers. If she attacks the sale aggressively, she invites court scrutiny. If she accepts it, she loses control and risks exposure anyway. That is what Mara engineered. A double bind. And here is the moral lesson that cuts through the theatrics. Systems built on injustice are vulnerable to paperwork because paperwork is indifferent. It does not care who deserves power. It cares who can prove power. When society builds a world where humans can be owned, it builds a world where ownership can transfer. It builds the conditions for reversals that feel like nightmares to the oppressor. Mara is not pretending the law is righteous. She is using it like a lever. And every person who hears this story should feel the indictment aimed beyond Nell and Rooker. This reversal is not a clever trick. It is evidence that the system's legitimacy was always fraudulent. A structure that can convert a woman into property and then, through a loophole, allow that same woman to reverse control without ever recognizing her humanity, has no moral authority. It has only force and habit. September 1850 approaches like a storm. Mara has what she needs: legal foothold, an intermediary with standing, and a frightened mistress whose secrets are now liabilities. The next step is not symbolic revenge. It is extraction of truth from a house that has been laundering cruelty into respectability since before Dorothea disappeared. And Mara intends to make forgetting impossible. October 1850. The Devereux townhouse is still standing, but it is no longer a kingdom. It is a scene under audit. That is the change Mara bought. Not comfort, not safety, access. The kind of access Nell Harrow Devereux spent years denying everyone else. The house that swallowed Dorothea Wynne is now forced to open its mouth. Nell tries to perform normalcy. She keeps her curtains neat. She keeps her invitations polite. She keeps her chin high in public. But inside, the order is broken. Joseph P. Clay's legal control over key household labor assignments, secured through the May 1850 court sale, means Nell cannot move bodies like furniture anymore without risk. Every transfer, every punishment, every sudden sale now carries a paper consequence. And in a slave society, paper is the one thing even the cruel pretend to respect, because paper is what makes cruelty profitable. Mara understands exactly what has happened. Nell is still dangerous, but she is no longer unquestioned. That alone changes everything. The oppressed don't need the oppressor to become kind. They need the oppressor to become accountable. Accountability, even partial, forces mistakes. Mistakes create records. Records create truth. So Mara begins where truth always begins in a house like this. The locked places. Not with melodrama, method. In October 1850, she starts reshaping the household routine under the cover of order. She requests keys through Clay's authority, framed as an inventory task for assets now under contested ownership. Nell resists, of course. She calls it insolence. She calls it meddling. She calls it a temporary confusion that will soon be reversed. But she hands over what she must, because refusing would invite exactly the scrutiny she fears. And in that handover, you can hear the first crack in her certainty. The first inventory is mundane by design. Pantry goods, linen stacks, silver counts. Mara does this intentionally. She wants witnesses to see her as reasonable. She wants the neighbors and clerks who might later testify to remember her as precise, not hysterical, because the system loves to dismiss black women by accusing them of emotion. Mara offers them something harder to erase: competence. Then she moves to the ledger. Nell's household ledger is a weapon disguised as bookkeeping. It contains costs for doctors, payments to night watchmen, fees for runaway notices, purchases of restraints, extra lie after certain nights, little financial bruises that match the physical ones. In October 1850, Mara doesn't rip it open in a burst of anger. She copies entries. She notes dates. She matches handwriting changes. She marks pages where Elias Rooker's influence is visible, where language shifts from household spending to legal cleanup. She is building a case file, not a diary. By November 1850, Nell's panic becomes obvious. She begins ordering sudden cleanups, scrubbing the cellar steps, replacing boards in a storage room, burning old linens, for hygiene. Hygiene is the word the guilty use when they mean destruction. Mara watches these orders like an investigator watches a suspect tampering with evidence. She records what was removed, who removed it, and when. She doesn't stop Nell directly every time, because stopping Nell would spark violence. Instead, she makes sure witnesses exist: kitchen staff, stable hands, a neighbor's servant passing through. The truth needs eyes, and the witnesses are there. This is what the public misses when they reduce enslaved people to silence. Households are porous. Goods move in and out. People move in and out. A townhouse is not a sealed box. It's a network node. In December 1850, Mara quietly gathers statements, not formal sworn testimony yet, because sworn testimony can get people killed, but consistent accounts. The stable boy who saw the late-night carriage in March 1846. The washerwoman who heard screaming the week Dorothea vanished. The cook from a neighboring house who saw a bundle carried out at dawn. Mara asks them for one thing: dates. She does not ask them to be brave in public. She asks them to be exact in private. Meanwhile, Nell tries to counterattack with something she understands: social pressure. She leans on church acquaintances. She whispers that Clay is a fraud, that outside agitators are interfering with her household. She tries to frame Mara as a manipulative servant who bewitched a free black man. The accusation is familiar because it's the only story slave society can tell when an enslaved person demonstrates strategy. It must be a trick, a curse, a perversion of natural order. They cannot admit intelligence without admitting guilt. Elias Rooker returns in January 1851 with a different posture. He no longer speaks as if the law is a private playground. He speaks as if the law might look at him. He warns Nell to be careful with threats, careful with punishments, careful with movements. He is not advising morality. He is advising optics. That is who he is. A man who believes truth is negotiable if the audience is managed. But here is what he cannot manage anymore: the house itself. Houses remember. In February 1851, Mara finds a locked trunk. One Nell insists contains old mourning clothes. Mara doesn't force it open herself. She forces it open through procedure. Clay's legal authority, a notary witness, an inventory notation. The contents are not a neat confession. Confessions rarely are. It's scraps. A child's ribbon. A torn sleeve. A metal clasp consistent with a restraint. A folded note in Rooker's handwriting listing payments and initials. Nothing screams crime on its own. That's how perpetrators survive, by keeping evidence fragmented. But fragments become a pattern when someone finally decides to assemble them. By March 1851, Nell is no longer only afraid of exposure. She is afraid of reversal. Complete reversal. The idea that she could be treated as property, as a transferable burden, terrifies her. And that terror reveals her own understanding of what she has done to others. People who truly believe slavery is benign do not panic when the leash touches their neck. Nell panics because she knows what the leash is for. Mara tightens the audit. She begins controlling who enters and exits the townhouse under Clay's authority, again framed as asset protection, not rebellion. She restricts late-night movements. She insists on written notes for errands. She introduces record-keeping where Nell relied on intimidation. This is not petty control. It is containment. She is preventing evidence from walking away. And then, in April 1851, the house produces the thing Nell has been trying to erase. Dorothea's thread. A former servant, Lavinia Pike, white, impoverished, once employed briefly by Nell, returns to Savannah after months away. Lavinia is not noble. She is not clean. She is motivated by resentment and survival. She approaches Mara indirectly, through Clay, with an offer. She knows what happened the week Dorothea disappeared. She wants money. That is how truth often arrives in corrupt systems, not as virtue, but as transaction. Mara pays, not because she admires Lavinia, but because the system has made truth expensive. Lavinia's account is ugly and specific. She places Rooker in the house on the night Dorothea vanished. She describes a hurried confinement in an upstairs room after an incident that Nell called discipline. She describes a carriage leaving before dawn with a bundle and 2 men. She does not claim to know Dorothea's final fate, only that the house moved fast, and that Nell's hands did not shake. The details matter because they are operational. Timing, people, movement. The kind of details courts cannot ignore as easily as grief. By May 1851, Mara has assembled enough to shift from audit to accusation. Not in public speeches, not in dramatic confrontation, but in structured pressure. She prepares a packet, copied ledger entries, inventory irregularities, witness dates, and Lavinia's statement, ready to place into a legal channel that forces response. She understands something most victims are denied: the ability to compel an institution to look. Institutions do not look because they are moral. They look because procedure requires it, because paperwork lands on a desk with a stamp and a deadline. Nell senses this shift and becomes more openly violent in private. She threatens Mara with sale to the far plantations, a phrase designed to evoke disappearance without saying it. Mara does not flinch in front of her, but she also does not pretend bravery makes her safe. She increases precautions. She stays near other witnesses. She avoids isolation. She communicates through Clay, because the moral truth remains. Courage without strategy is just a corpse the system can bury. And here is the sermon we owe the dead. Dorothea Wynn's disappearance is not a mystery in the romantic sense. It is a crime that survived because people cooperated with forgetting. The Devereaux townhouse was protected by neighbors' silence, by the church's politeness, by the court's assumptions, and by men like Rooker who turned atrocity into paperwork. Mara's reversal forces all of them to face what they allowed. That's why the house feels haunted now, not by ghosts, but by accountability. The next step is the one Nell fears most: the courtroom, where her curated innocence must compete with records she cannot intimidate into silence. July 1852. Chatham County's courthouse is not a temple of justice. It is a factory of legitimacy. It stamps some lives as property and some lies as truth, and then it calls the result order. That is the building Nell Harrow Devereaux has relied on her whole adult life. But now she walks toward it with a different face. Tight, wary, calculating, because the same machinery she used to erase Dorothea Wynne is about to be forced to process something it was never designed to admit. That the Devereaux household's respectability is a costume, and the seams are visible. The case begins the way these cases always begin. Not with the crime, but with the paperwork. Nell's legal team, led by Elias Rooker, files to challenge the May 1850 court sale and to invalidate Clay's title. They call it fraud. They call it improper influence. They call it defective procedure. The strategy is obvious because it is cowardly. Don't argue about Dorothea. Don't argue about violence. Argue about forms and signatures. Because if the court can be persuaded the sale was flawed, everything Mara has built collapses before the judges ever have to acknowledge the human suffering inside that townhouse. This is how power survives, by keeping the conversation technical so the blood never reaches the transcript. Rooker's accusations are designed to sound neutral while screaming their real message. A black woman cannot be the author of a legal reversal. He cannot say that outright in a filing, not cleanly, not without revealing the ugliness. So he translates it into language the court can pretend is objective. Capacity, standing, coercion, impossibility. The word impossible is doing the work of racism without naming it. It is a demand that the world revert to its old shape. Joseph P. Clay appears in court as the official face of the purchase. He wears clean clothes. He speaks carefully. He does not volunteer emotion, because emotion is what the court uses to dismiss you. His posture is simple. He participated in a public, court-ordered sale. He paid. The clerk accepted. The transfer was stamped. Procedure was followed. The court's own seal is on the record. If the sale is invalid, it is the court indicting itself. That is the trap Mara set. Not a romantic trap. A bureaucratic one. Behind Clay sits Mara, present, silent, categorized by the court as an object adjacent to the case. She is not allowed to be the central voice. The system will not grant her that dignity. But she is the central force, and everyone in that room understands it, even if they will not say it aloud. Nell looks at her the way people look at a locked door that has somehow opened from the inside. August 1852. The court starts where it feels safe. The sales mechanics. Notices. Dates. Records. The clerk testifies that notice was posted. The lender testifies that debts were real. The registrar confirms the transfer stamp. Rooker tries to smear Clay as a front, suggesting he acted for others, that he was directed. He wants the court to see the purchase as a trick, not a transaction. Clay answers without flinching. Intermediaries are common. Purchases on behalf of investors happen routinely. The court has processed them for years. If the court objects now, it must admit it has been sloppy for years, or admit it is objecting because it dislikes who benefited this time. This is where the moral rot shows. The court is comfortable admitting incompetence before it is comfortable admitting bias. But even that reluctance can be leveraged. Because once you admit incompetence, you admit the paperwork may contain truths you didn't intend to validate. And that cracks the facade. September 1852. Rooker attempts to narrow the scope aggressively. He argues that any discussion of the Devereux household's private discipline is irrelevant. He insists the case is about ownership, not abuse. This is the classic move. Separate the mechanism from the harm it produces, so the harm becomes outside the record. But Mara's packet, assembled in 1851 and refined through 1852, forces the connection. Because the abuse is not only a moral claim. It appears in the ledger. It appears as payments. It appears as medical bills timed after punishments. It appears as hush money. It appears in inventory anomalies that only exist because someone was trying to erase something. The judge permits limited questioning. Limited is still dangerous. Limited is still a door cracked open. And once a door is cracked, the smell leaks out. Witnesses begin appearing in October 1852. Not all at once. Not with heroic speeches. With cautious, fragmented statements. The stable boy, now older, voice shaking, confirms the late-night carriage in March 1846, the week Dorothea vanished. The washerwoman confirms she heard screaming, and the next day Nell ordered extra lye and bandages. Lavinia Pike, the former servant, testifies reluctantly, eyes darting toward Nell and Rooker as if they can still destroy her. She places Rooker in the house on the night Dorothea disappeared. She describes the hurried movement before dawn. She admits she took hush money. The admission is ugly, but it is credible precisely because it is ugly. People lying to look good do not confess to being paid off. Rooker tries to discredit them all. He calls them unreliable. He calls them poor. He calls them suggestible. He calls them motivated. Means they are not the kind of people the court respects. He is correct. The court does not respect them. But the court does respect patterns in paperwork. And Mara has made sure every witness statement aligns with a paper trace. A doctor bill, a watchman payment, a missing inventory item, a runaway notice purchased after the disappearance. The court may ignore a tear. It is harder to ignore a ledger that matches the tear. November 1852. Nell's mask starts slipping, not in confession, but in contempt. She mutters under her breath when witnesses speak. She insists Dorothea was a problem, a liar, a thief. She cannot stop herself from smearing the girl she claims simply ran away. The contradiction is revealing. If Dorothea truly fled, why does Nell speak of her with such controlled anger, as if she fears what Dorothea could have said? That fear is the tell. And then the court circles back to the core question. Was the sale valid? Here is the cold truth. The court is not eager to validate a reversal that empowers a black woman indirectly. But the court is also unwilling to announce that its own stamped transfer is meaningless. In a system built on paperwork, the court's legitimacy depends on its stamps meaning something. So it searches for a compromise. Uphold procedure while minimizing the narrative damage. Uphold the sale but avoid calling the Devereux household criminal. Protect the machine even if the human truth remains partially buried. December 1852. A ruling arrives that is both vindication and indictment. The court refuses to void the May 1850 sale outright, citing procedure. Clay's title stands. The transfer remains in effect. Nell does not get her easy restoration of absolute control. But the court also limits further inquiry into Dorothea's fate, calling some testimony speculative, pushing the darkest details back into the shadows where they can rot quietly. This is what justice often looks like in slave society. The machinery protects itself first, then permits a narrow correction that preserves its image. Yet even a narrow correction has consequences. Nell's reputation is wounded. Not destroyed. Wounded. In a place like Savannah, that matters. Invitations slow. Whisper networks accelerate. Merchants tighten credit. The church smiles less warmly. And inside the townhouse, Nell is forced to live with the humiliation of being procedurally constrained by the very system she trusted to protect her. The oppressor, for once, cannot simply declare reality and have everyone comply. January 1853. Rooker attempts to negotiate behind the scenes. A settlement, a private arrangement, a quiet restoration in exchange for money and silence. The offer itself is a confession that he fears exposure more than he fears wrongdoing. Mara refuses, not loudly, not theatrically. She refuses by continuing the record-keeping, by continuing the inventory, by continuing to protect witnesses, by continuing to make forgetting difficult. Because she understands what the court will not say. If Dorothea Wynne is left as a rumor, the system wins. And if the system wins, it will keep eating girls like Dorothea and calling it order. This is the moral demand at the heart of the story. Not that Mara becomes a saint. Not that the law becomes righteous. But that someone, denied recognition, still forces a record into existence. When institutions are built to erase, the act of documenting becomes a form of resistance. And when a society trains itself to forget, the refusal to forget becomes a kind of prosecution. That is what Mara has done. She turned the oppressor's own paperwork into a mirror. The mirror does not show everything, but it shows enough to stain the image forever. February 1853. The courthouse has spoken in its careful, cowardly way, enough procedure to protect its own stamp, not enough courage to name the crime. That is how institutions survive. They acknowledge what they must and deny what they can. But the Devereux townhouse cannot return to the old world. The ruling that preserved Clay's title does something Nell Harrow Devereux cannot tolerate. It leaves her exposed to control she does not own. And for a woman raised on the certainty of mastery, exposure feels like suffocation. Nell tries to rebuild her dominion with the tools she has left: intimidation, rumor, and private violence. She no longer has clean authority. She has spite. In early February 1853, she begins a campaign to isolate Mara, restricting access, ordering servants not to speak to her, threatening anyone seen near Joseph P. Clay. This is the standard move of a collapsing regime. Cut the witness network, starve the information flow, make everyone believe they are alone. But Mara has already learned the core principle of survival under tyranny. The strongest weapon is coordination disguised as routine. She does not announce a resistance. She maintains one. Clay stays in Savannah through February and March 1853, not as a conqueror, but as a shield. His legal standing is the paper wall between Mara and the worst outcomes. Yet that wall is thin. A free black man in 1853 can be arrested on pretexts, harassed by patrols, accused of inciting disorder, or simply driven out. Nell understands this. So does Elias Rooker. And, by March 1853, the counter-strategy becomes clear. They cannot overturn the sale easily, so they will undermine the people holding its leverage. They will make Clay and Mara too expensive to protect. Rooker's next play is not law. It is manipulation dressed as law. On March 18th, 1853, he files motions and letters with the tone of procedural necessity, requests for reviews, claims of irregular enforcement, complaints that Clay is interfering with household operations. The goal is not to win on merit. It is to exhaust. to pile paperwork until Clay spends his days answering and his nights worrying. Bureaucracy, when weaponized, is a form of violence. It drains time. It creates fear. It forces mistakes. Mara responds with the only effective counter: precision. She continues the inventory. She continues the ledger cross-checks. She continues collecting statements, now with more care than ever, because retaliation is most dangerous after partial victory. She also makes a decision that defines the endgame. She converts private knowledge into a durable record that can outlive her. Not a dramatic confession in the street, an organized file. Names, dates, payments, movements. Dorothea Wynn's thread is no longer only oral. It is documentary. April 1853. Nell's social defenses keep collapsing. Her friends don't abandon her out of morality. They distance themselves out of self-preservation. Respectability is a herd instinct. Once the herd senses contamination, it steps away. That change has consequences inside the townhouse. Servants who once believed they were trapped under Nell's total protection that was actually captivity, begin to see her as vulnerable. Vulnerability is not justice, but it is opportunity. In mid-April, a young enslaved woman named Eliza Brand, 19, confides to Mara that she has seen the upstairs room where Dorothea was held. She describes scrape marks on the floor, a ring bolt in the wall, and a patch of plaster that looks newer than it should. This is not courtroom proof by itself. It is a location. A target for verification. Mara doesn't rush to tear walls down. That would invite immediate retaliation. She turns it into another inventory issue, another maintenance note, another procedural requirement. On April 27, 1853, Clay authorizes a structural inspection framed as asset preservation. Two men enter under the cover of legitimate work. They find the ring bolt. They find the altered plaster. They find, tucked behind loose boardwork, a small packet, cloth-wrapped, containing what looks like a braided ribbon and a broken clasp. Again, fragments. But fragments with context. Dorothea's age, her role, the timing of her disappearance, the sudden repairs ordered afterward. The house is not confessing. It is leaking. May 1853. Nell's anger hardens into something reckless. She begins making threats that are no longer subtle. She tells another servant she will sell them downriver if they speak. She tells Clay he is playing with fire. She tells Mara privately, with a smile that is meant to be a blade, that the law will remember what you are. The sentence is not a prediction. It is a promise. That the system will always try to reassert the hierarchy, even if it has to do it through unofficial channels. And this is where the narrator must be blunt. When law fails to punish power, power turns to violence to restore itself. So Mara accelerates the only safe move left. Dissemination. A record that stays in one trunk can be burned. A record that lives in multiple hands becomes harder to erase. In June 1853, she arranges copies, partial, distributed, through trusted contacts. A church clerk sympathetic for reasons of his own, a dock worker who moves packages without questions, a seamstress who hides paper between bolts of cloth. No one person holds the entire file. That is not paranoia. That is operational security, learned in a world where a single arrest can collapse a network. And then there is Dorothea. The story cannot end with maybe. Not if we are honest. Not if we respect the dead. The truth is, in a place like this, certainty is often what perpetrators steal first. They don't only harm bodies, they sabotage knowledge. They turn victims into rumors so society can sleep. By July 1853, Mara's file has enough to assert a prosecutorial conclusion even without a recovered body. Dorothea Wynne was confined, abused, and removed by coordinated action involving Nell's household and facilitated by Rooker's legal cover. The absence of a corpse is not innocence. It is evidence of how effective the system is at disposal. August 1853. Clay receives notice of increased harassment by patrols. Men follow him. He is questioned for nothing. This is not random. It is pressure. The message is simple. Leave or be crushed. Clay does what survival requires. He prepares to depart Savannah before the cage closes. But before he goes, he does the one thing that makes Nell's victory impossible. He files portions of the record into official channels that cannot be quietly misplaced without consequence. A clerk receives it. A docket number is created. It may not lead to immediate punishment. Institutions rarely move fast against the powerful, but it makes the scandal durable. It converts rumor into a registered problem. September 1853. Nell tries to reclaim narrative control one last time. She hosts a small gathering. She smiles. She speaks of misunderstandings and outside interference. She attempts to rewrap herself in social fabric. But social fabric is not armor when the seams have been exposed. People now associate her name with questions, with inconsistencies, with a missing girl whose absence has a timeline. And that is the quiet defeat. Nell cannot restore the old innocence because the record exists. Mara's end is not a triumphant parade. Stories like this rarely end with applause. They end with aftermath. She remains in danger because every day in 1853, a black woman's safety is conditional. But she has achieved what the system most feared. She has forced memory into structure. She has made forgetting inconvenient. And in a society built to erase, inconvenience is a crack that can widen over time. Here is the moral reckoning we are obligated to name. The law did not save Dorothea Wynne. The court did not avenge her. The church did not protect her. Respectable neighbors did not demand answers. A young enslaved woman, denied personhood, did what institutions refused to do. She documented. She leveraged procedure. She turned the oppressor's own machinery into a tool of exposure. That does not make the world fair. It makes the world honest enough to be judged. And now the story belongs to whoever refuses to let it be filed away as curious. Do not sanitize it into inspiration. Do not reduce it to a clever trick. It is a case study in how cruelty hides behind paperwork, and how paperwork, when seized by the ignored, can become a blade. If you have a theory about what ultimately happened to Dorothea, sold, killed, concealed, say it plainly. The dead do not need our comfort. They need our refusal to forget. And now it's on you. Subscribe. Comment where you're listening from. And tell me your theory. What was Dorothea Wynne to the Devereux house? A witness they silenced, a victim they sold, or a crime they buried? Say it plainly. The dead don't need our comfort. They need our refusal to forget. Forget.